Well, good morning and welcome to the Cato Institute. My name is Marian Tupi. I'm a senior policy analyst here at Cato, and I also edit the website called humanprogress.org. Human Progress is a website that provides a realistic picture of the state of humanity, a state that is in many important ways much better than people can gauge from apocalyptic newspaper headlines. But of course, in our efforts, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and none more so than Julian Salmon, to whose life and work today's forum is dedicated. Julian was in many ways a scholar, a humanist, was many things. He was a scholar, he was a humanist, he was an optimist, but above all, he was immensely courageous. There is no courage in following the crowd screaming, "The end is nigh, we are all going to die," swimming against the current of public opinion, which was immensely hostile to his views in the 1960s and the 1970s. Julian must have felt very lonely indeed. But that did not prevent him from leaving a great scholarly legacy on which the work of the Salmon Project, which I will be presenting shortly, intends to build. But to start our proceedings today, I would like to welcome Julian's son, David, to recall the life and times of his late father. David.
My sister Judy, who is with us today, and my brother Daniel, who could not join us today, and I are very happy that Marian, Gale, and Cato, the Cato Institute, have developed the Salmon Abundance Index. The Salmon Abundance Index continues a long connection between my father and the Cato Institute. My father was a Cato adjunct scholar. Cato published some of his monographs. Cato hosted a memorial event after he died. And in 2000, Cato published It's Getting Better All the Time, 100 Greatest Trends of the Last 100 Years, a book that former Cato Fiscal Studies Director Stephen Moore, who started his economics career as my father's research assistant, and then became a frequent collaborator with him, wrote with my father and finished after my father's death. Marian asked me to say a few words about my father's optimism. It is important to understand that his optimism about long-term economic trends for population growth, natural resources, and the state of humanity did not result from inherent optimism. It instead resulted from compiling and analyzing the longest, broadest, and deepest data sets concerning human well-being. Using this data, his work showed that population growth around the world has led to people living longer, healthier, and more prosperous lives, that the natural resources that people use have become more available, less expensive, and that as people prosper, environmental quality improves. It is this data that made him optimistic about the state and future of humanity. As he put it, "This is my long-run forecast in brief. The material conditions of life will continue to get better for most people in most countries, most of the time, indefinitely. Within a century or two, all nations and most of humanity will be at or above today's Western living standards." In fact, I think it'll happen even faster. I also speculate, however, that many people will continue to think and say that conditions of life are getting worse. The data that the Salmon Abundance Index has compiled and builds on this work. 3 big points were key to his outlook. First, one of his great insights was that the continual process for human beings is that we face challenges, such as the high price of what appears to be a scarce resource. We struggle, and then, often guided by price incentives, we find a better solution. We find a solution that makes the resource or a better substitute more available at lower prices. The fracking revolution that has led to vast new production of oil and gas is a classic example of this process. Even with OPEC exerting efforts to keep prices high, many now often worry, not this moment, but a few months ago, about oil prices being too low rather than too high. In other words, human beings face problems, we solve them, and then we're better off than we were before the problems arose. It's important to note that he did not say that the world does not have problems. The world has many, many serious problems. Population growth indeed causes problems, but it is population growth that provides the tools to develop solutions that leave us better off. As he put it, I do not say that everything now is fine, of course. Children are still hungry and sick. Some people live out lives of physical and intellectual poverty and lack of opportunity. War or some new pollution may do us all in. What I am saying is that for most of the relevant economic matters that I've checked, the trends are positive rather than negative. Adding more people causes problems, but people are also the means to solve these problems, he wrote. Second, population growth is not a problem. It is lack of political and economic freedom that causes human suffering. As he put it, even talented and energetic people require an incentive to create better techniques and organizations and protection for their property that is the fruit of their labors. Therefore, the political economic structure is the crucial determinant of the speed with which economic development occurs. In the presence of economic liberty and respect for property, population growth causes fewer problems in the short run and greater benefits in the short run than where the state controls economic activity. Third, population growth not only solves problems, it is population growth that is the big driver that leads to human progress. As he put it, the main fuel to speed our progress is our stock of knowledge, and the brake is our lack of imagination. The ultimate resource is people, skilled, spirited, and hopeful people who will exert their wills and imaginations for their own benefit. And inevitably, they will benefit not only themselves, but the rest of us as well. He did, however, oh, by the way, he found that immigration is the most beneficial kind of population growth. He did, however, identify one resource that is becoming more scarce: people. There was only one resource which has shown a trend of increasing scarcity, he wrote, rather than increasing abundance. That resource is the most important of all: human beings. There are more people on Earth now than ever before, but if we measure the scarcity of people the same way we measure the scarcity of other economic goods, by how much we must pay to obtain their services, we see that wages and salaries have been going up all over the world, in poor countries as well as in rich countries. The amount you must pay to obtain the services of a driver or a cook has risen in India, just as the price of a driver or a cook or an economist has risen in the United States over the decades. This increase in the price of people's services is a clear indication that people are becoming more scarce, even though there are more of us. The Wall Street Journal on February 11 of this year highlighted this point in an article about China, the most populous country in the world, but which for decades limited its people to having only one child. China has a labor shortage, believe it or not. It now has too few people. They wrote, "Somewhere Julian Simon is smiling. In the 1970s and 1980s, the World Bank, the Club of Rome, author Paul Ehrlich, and the United Nations predicted a catastrophe if China's government couldn't stop its people from having babies. Simon argued from his post at the University of Illinois that this was wrong. He said the problem wasn't too many Chinese, but the political and economic system oppressing them. Simon even predicted in 1985 that if China opened its economy to market forces, the growth might leave China facing a labor shortage. Well, here we are. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences recently confirmed that Simon, who died in 1998, was right. In its Green Book of Population and Labor, the Academy now says China's population will start to decline in 2030, and the decline is, quote, unstoppable, unquote, and it is, quote, bound to cause very unfavorable social and economic consequences, unquote, especially in a society that is rapidly aging. On that note, I'll say thank you, Marian, thank you, Gale, thank you, Cato, and thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much, David. Our next speaker is Gale Puli. He is the Associate Professor of Economics at BYU. He has taught at Al Faisal University in Riyadh, also at BYU Idaho, Boise State University, and the College of Idaho. He serves on the board of humanprogress.org. It was a true pleasure to work with him on a paper which we published late last year. And what I asked Gale to do this morning is to explain the main components of our research and to appraise the audience with the latest numbers pertaining to the Salmon Abundance Index. With that, help me welcome Gale Puli.
Well, thank you all very much for being with us today. Thank you, Cato, for sponsoring this event. And I also want to thank the internet, especially Twitter. Without Twitter, I would have never discovered Marion. So God bless the internet. I'm especially grateful also for the opportunity to meet David Simon. David, your father was a great inspiration to all of us. Professor Simon had the facts and this beautiful theory. But he had something much more important. He had the courage to stand up to anyone, anywhere, to defend his facts and his arguments. He was a true David surrounded by Goliaths. So thank you, David, for being with us this morning. None of us would be here without the courage of your father to speak the truth. In the last Avengers movie, Thanos says, "The universe is finite. Its resources finite. If life is left unchecked, life will cease to exist. It needs correcting." Any idea where Thanos got his inspiration?
Oh, he looks like it.
Society needs rescaling. We've got to reduce the size of the entire human enterprise. Well, the Guardians of the Galaxy show up. These two men agreed on one thing, that there is a relationship between population and prices. Ehrlich argued that as population increased, prices would increase, resulting in scarcity. Julian argued the opposite, that as population increases, prices would actually decrease. So who was right? Well, fortunately, they bet. Behold, one of the most important checks ever written in economics. Of the 5 metals Ehrlich chose, copper, chromium, nickel, tin, and tungsten, the real price had fallen over 10 years by over 57%. So our project begins by asking this question: would Julian still win that bet today? So first of all, we thought he was too generous in his bet. We thought his odds were too good. If you remember, he had an unlimited downside and only a limited upside. We also think that using real prices maybe underestimated what was truly happening. We think that he should have used time prices instead.
What prices?
Time prices. Time prices. Convert prices to time. That's where the real measurement is. And we also, well, we'll give George a reference here about how important time is when we measure abundance. So our paper does 5 things. First of all, we offer a new definition of abundance. Secondly, we take the 5 commodities that were in this bet, we expand it to 50 commodities. We also convert these prices to time prices. We think that's a much better way to measure scarcity. We develop a new equation that we call the price elasticity of population. And we also then offer a new index to measure this abundance. We quantify this definition and we measure it. So abundance. We define abundance as the relationship between prices and population, the same as Julian would, the same as Ehrlich would have. So we begin with these 50 commodities. We call them the foundation commodities. So we have energy, food, materials, metal, and precious metals. We go to the World Bank and the IMF to get this data. We go back to 1980. They fortunately keep a great record. So we begin with their data. And then we also, the next step is we recognize that innovation shows up lots of different places. It shows up in lower prices, but it also shows up in higher incomes. And to really see the full picture, we've got to look at both the change in income and the change in prices. It really allows us to see the whole picture. Adam Smith recognized this when he said, the real price of everything is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. What is bought with money is purchased by labor. George will confirm that. Unlike central bank currencies, time is not subject to inflation. So, a little review here. Money prices are expressed in dollars and cents. Time prices are expressed in hours and minutes. When we look at money prices, there are kind of two prices that we think about, the nominal price and the real price. The real price is simply the nominal price divided by a deflator. Time prices, we just take a price of an item and divide it by hourly income. That allows us to determine how much time it takes to work to acquire that item. Note that time prices can decline two ways. The price can fall or income can increase. If either one of these two things happen, you'll see time prices decline. So we look at prices from the World Bank, and for the denominator for hourly income, we went back to the World Bank and looked at their per capita GDP. With that, we then went to the Conference Board, who publishes annual hours worked, and used that to calculate what the GDP per hour would be. With those variables, we then were able to analyze these 50 commodities. So let's just take a moment and look at oranges, for example, one of the items in our database. So 1980, World Bank reports that a kilo of oranges was about 40 cents. In 2017, they'd more than doubled to 81 cents. During that same period, per capita GDP was a little more than 2,500 per person. It had increased to over 10,000 per person by 2017. The hours worked, note the decline there, about a 9% decline from 2168 down to 1964. If we take the GDP per capita and divide by the hours worked, that will get us a GDP per capita per hour. So $1.16 in 1980, $5.34 in 2017. So with that, we can calculate the time price of oranges. 40 cents divided by $1.16 would suggest about 0.345 hours, or about 21 minutes to buy a kilo of oranges. By 2017, the price had dropped to 9 minutes, so we had a 56% decrease in the cost of oranges. So we take these nominal prices from the World Bank, we divide by the GDP per capita per hour to get the time price, and then we index those to 1980, and then we plot that trend, and we do this with all of the commodities. We also kind of look at a little regression. You'll note that you'll see spikes in that trend line. And Professor Simon said this is what you expect to have happen. You'll have periods where you will have spikes. When those occur, you'll have four things that will happen. People will use less. They will try to find more, discover more, make more. They will also recycle. It's kind of hard to recycle an orange, but you can recycle steel and aluminum and lots of other things. And they will also search for substitutes. Those four things will cause the price to actually end up being lower. And we see that in this trend line as well. A couple of other things that we can do with percentage change that give us a little more insight is we can also develop a multiplier. We can compute the compounded annual growth rate, and we can also calculate the years to double. The multiplier simply says how many units of an item the same amount of time would purchase at different points of time. The equation is 1 divided by 1 plus the percentage change. Note that this relationship is not linear, it's geometric. Once we have the multiplier, we can calculate the compounded annual growth rate. The multiplier raised to 1 over the number of years minus 1 will give you that compounded annual growth rate. Once you have that, you can use the rule of 70s to calculate how many years it takes to double something in size. You can also use logarithms to do that. You can also use a financial calculator or Excel to calculate both the growth rate and the multiplier. So with that, let's go back and take a look at oranges. They dropped by 56%. That would indicate a multiplier of 2.27. So the time it took me in 1980 to earn the money to buy an orange, that same amount of time would get me 2.27 oranges in 2017. At that rate, oranges are compounding at 2.24%, which means every 31 years you get twice as many oranges. So we take all of our commodities, do our analysis on them, get them all indexed to 100 in 1980, put them together, and that's what our trend line looks like. Every one of our commodities actually fell in price of the 50. Zinc, 17.5%, sugar, over 83%. The average was around 64.7%. So we take the whole index, apply it, time price 64.7 would say your multiplier is 2.83. I buy this basket in 1980. For the same amount of time, I get 2.83 times as much in 2017. That's growing at 2.85% a year. Every 25 years, abundance doubles. So the next thing we did is we developed a new equation that we call the price elasticity of population. If you're familiar with these equations from Micro 101, price elasticity of demand and cross price elasticity. There won't be an exam on this. So our equation is price elasticity, or price change, the percentage change in time prices divided by the percentage change in population. Also note that we always assume that population is increasing, so our denominator is always positive. So when we look back at the data, we index both population and our commodities to 100 in 1980. Population grew from about 4.5 billion to over 7.5 billion. We added 3 billion people to the planet, almost a 70% increase in population. During the same 37-year period, prices fell, time prices fell by almost 65%. So when we plug those values into our equation, 64.7, 69.3, we get a coefficient of minus 0.934. The way we interpret this is for every 1% increase in population, abundance increased, time prices fell by 1%. We also discovered there are 4 abundance zones that we can look to from this equation. Decreasing abundance, emerging abundance, accelerating abundance, and superabundance. So what I want to ask you to do a little math problem here with me. So in 1980, you invite 100 guests over for dinner. It's going to cost you $10 per guest to buy the food and beverage. What would the cost be? Be $1,000. So in 2017, you have 69% more guests, but your costs have fallen by 65%. What's your bill going to be? Well, I think it's 169 times 350. So your bill's going to be $591.50. Is that right? We see it? Ignore inflation because these are time prices. So just look at this for a second. Your bill is actually 40% less today than it was in 1980. So what is superabundance? One of the 4 categories that we identify as superabundance. Superabundance occurs when no matter how many more people come to dinner, your bill decreases. So the last thing we did was we developed a Salmon Abundance Index. We quantify and then measure this degree of abundance where we're recognizing both population and prices. We set the index equal to 100 in 1980. The equation for that is just 1 plus the percentage change in population divided by 1 plus the percentage change in time prices times 100. So population increased by 70%. Prices fell by 65%, so our denominator there is 0.35. We multiply that times 100, we get a value of 479. We can also think about it this way: what's the change in the multiplier times the percentage change, 1 plus the percentage change in population times 100. Our multiplier, remember, 2.83 today relative to 1980. We have 70% more people times 100 would also give us that 479.6. So here's the index from 1980. Yes, there were periods where abundance declined, but look at that overall trend. Continues to move, continues to move. So in summary, 1980, our index was 100. 2017, it had increased to 479, indicating a 379% increase. That suggests that this is growing at about 4.33% a year, and abundance will double every 16 years. So our project, once again, we create a new definition for abundance. We expand it to 50 commodities. Going back to 1980, we convert this data to time prices. We have developed a new equation, the price elasticity of population, and we also offer a new index, the Salmon Abundance Index. I actually think that Professor Salmon was awarded the Nobel Prize this year. Paul Romer stood in as proxy. An economy grows whenever people take resources and rearrange them in a way that makes them more valuable. Rearranging is freedom. Value is where markets allow you to discover if you've created something of value. Another way to think about it is how many keys are on a piano? I think there's 88. How many songs are in a piano? Well, biologists and politicians like Ehrlich and Thanos would say you should just count the keys. Economists like Julian would say, no, you should listen to the almost infinite variety of imagination that produces music from this device. I would just conclude by saying if Julian were here today, he would tell us to listen to the music. He would say that every human being that's here has gifts and superpowers. And if we have the freedom to create and the liberty to trade with one another, that we can create this astonishing abundance. And we can defeat the darkness of Thanos and his minions. Please join Julian in this new Guardians of the Galaxy. Thank you.
Well, Gale, that was one hell of a talk. Tough act to follow, but I am. Your students are truly blessed to have you. Thank you very much for summing up our research so crisply. Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to do very, very briefly, because we really want to go over to George. I want to launch the Salmon Project website. Salmon Project website will be a part of humanprogress.org. In the header, you will see the Salmon Project. Upon clicking on it, You will see a little welcome from Julian and a little description of the great wager that Julian took up with Ehrlich. Below that, and of course that is linked to the study itself, which Gale and I have written last year. Below that, you will be able to see the four components of our research: time, price of resources, price elasticity of population, Salmon abundance framework, and the Salmon abundance index. And upon clicking on each of these, you will then encounter the relevant part of the work. This is basically the evolution, the percentage evolution in time prices of the 50 commodities that Gale and I worked with. And if you hover over any of these, you will get a sense of how time prices have evolved over time over those 37 years. So we start at 100, and you can see that by 1982, which is to say 2 years later, the price goes up to 78. But by the time that you get to 2017, the price is well below 100, and it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 18. The highest price increase that you can observe here is that of natural gas, which rose to 186% over 1980 in 2005, and that's when we have the fracking revolution kicking in, and as you can see, it continues on a downward spiral. Now let me just zoom out of this and just show you the overall trend, as I'm sure you can see, is a downward trend, and you can play around with this and see the time prices of different resources as you click through the chart. Below the chart, we have the summary of the findings that Gale presented a short while ago, and an introductory video to the time price of resources, which will basically explain in a way that students, for example, can understand what time prices are all about. And the same goes for the price elasticity of population. Once again, it's an explanation of the concept, followed by the explanatory video at the bottom, and Salmon abundance framework and Salmon abundance index as well, always accompanied with an explanatory video. Now, on the my right-hand side, you will see publications. Whenever we publish anything that pertains to the abundance of resources and the Salmon project, this will automatically populate so that at the top you will get the latest writings from our team on the relationship between population growth and declining prices of resources. And of course, you'll also be able to watch videos as they are created.
7.7 billion people and counting. More people means more consumers, so resources are getting scarcer and costlier by the day. Dead wrong. Yes, in every single moment you can find a commodity that's surging in price. But that surge is also a signal, an incentive to people to go out and find more of it or use less of it, recycle more or find a substitute. So in the long run, prices tend to fall. And this has now been thoroughly documented by Gale, Puli and Marianne Tupy with their Salmon Abundance Index.
Johan cannot convince you, nobody can. And please do sign up for the news in our sign-up box and explore the Salmon project at your leisure. With that, let me welcome our last speaker, George Gilder, who is one of the leading economic and technological thinkers of the past 40 years. He's the author of 19 books, including Wealth and Poverty, Life After Television, Knowledge and Power, Scandal of Money, and Life After Google. He is the founding fellow of the Discovery Institute, where he began his study of information theory, and is also an influential venture investor. Please help me welcome George Gilder.
Thank you. I think this is a wonderful event, and I'm really excited to be part of it. Julian Simon had a tremendous impact on me as I was working in the carols of supply-side economics and facing the overwhelming academic belief that human beings were inexorably burdens on the planet. And this has led me to the conclusion that Julian Simon was the most important economist of the 20th century, and his shadow is being carried forward by Gale and Marion to render him the most important economist of the 21st century. Many economists have had tremendous influence, but nearly all of them have been wrong. And so it's not so hard to be the most important economist as you might imagine. And one of the tests of failed paradigm is its endless furbelows of complexity. It becomes more and more difficult to understand as it's developed further. And in the end, it becomes a tangle of enigmas and really inapplicable. And I think the dominant policies of Keynesianism, macroeconomics, macromancy, as it's been called, are suffering from the death throes of a failed paradigm. And Julian Simon's gigantic, simple, but powerful and ever more persuasive vision is looming ever more significantly in our lives. And this has been something of a triumphalist set of speeches so far. We hear about the dramatic victory in the great wager with Ehrlich. And this is an exciting affirmation, and we all should be encouraged by it. But in my belief is this battle has not even remotely been won, that the biggest threat to the U.S. economy today is that it's all sicklied o'er by a pale cast of green goo, based on the Ehrlich vision that human beings are intrinsically burdens on the planet rather than the redemption of the planet. And this is really the central issue in all our politics. The socialists have changed from reds to greens, and they are still battling the Simon vision from a different angle. This is climate change. Blaming conservatives for the weather is the chief theme of the left in these times. So this, I think this was that we are discussing the central figure of 20th and 21st century economics. And Ehrlich really has the great wager. There was one great wager that Julian initiated, but the second great wager was Ehrlich really persuaded the Chinese to launch their one-child policy. And here was another great wager with a catastrophic victory by the Simon vision. And I think that is probably more important than that $5,000. So I've been working since then on information theory of economics that really springs from Julian's vision that the ultimate resource is human beings. Human creativity is the ultimate resource. And the key insight is that, as Albert Hirschman of Princeton put it in an essay on development economics, that when he surveyed all the various plans that had been launched around the world for economic growth, he showed that, or to stimulate development, he showed that it was a sort of apparently random outcome which development projects succeeded, which plans triumphed, and which ones failed. And that what differentiated them was solely the differences in the surprising creativity of human beings. That's what differentiated. Creativity always comes as a surprise to us. If it didn't, we wouldn't need it, and socialism would work. The information theory of economics takes this insight and converges it with Shannon's insight that information itself is best defined as unexpected bits or surprising outcomes. So this allows you to converge the economics of human creativity with the information theory that has underlied all advances in computer science and technology and communications that have fueled the world economy for the last 50 years. And there are three central propositions that come from this information theory of economics that allows you to incorporate entrepreneurial surprise in economic models as the flow of information, which itself is identified as surprise. And the first proposition is that wealth is essentially knowledge. That's, as Simon put it, the stock of knowledge. Wealth is knowledge. And we know that because, as Thomas Sowell put it, the Neanderthal in his cave had all the physical resources we have today. The difference between our age and the Stone Age is the increase of knowledge. But that affords a further insight. What is economic growth? Economic growth is learning. And I really came to this conclusion when I was studying learning curves. It's the most fully developed and documented proposition in business is the learning curve. It started at Boston Consulting Group and moved to Bain and Company as the experience curve. But they all are learning curves that show with every doubling of total output sold, prices drop between 20 and 30%. And a lot of those, what we saw there in all those charts are a mass of learning curves. I bet if they were really plotted as learning curves, they would fit this model pretty well. And Moore's law is the most famous learning curve. And in an article in Wired 20 years ago or so, I really went through and in Telecosm and Microcosm, I think, but better in the Wired article, I went through how Moore's law is really a learning curve. And the reason it seems to be such a more powerful and rapid phenomenon is because doubling of units, essentially transistors, occurred so much faster than other learning curves. But essentially, it fits the model. And from poultry broilers to insurance policies to transistors to lines of software code to trucking miles, it doesn't matter. You see learning curves all across the economy. And that's not an accident. That is because growth is learning, and it's a particular kind of learning, Popperian learning. In order to have a learning process, you got to expound your business proposition in terms that can be refuted, that are falsifiable. And capitalism works and produces knowledge and learning because it is a perfect mechanism modeled almost as if it were modeled on the scientific process of enabling creative human beings to pursue business plans that are falsifiable, that can go bankrupt. And whenever government, through the central bank or through Keynesian stimuli or any other such policy, try to guarantee growth, to use power rather than knowledge in order to create growth, they actually prohibit it. A government guarantee stifles learning and thus prevents economic growth. And as the spread of efforts to guarantee growth in a counter-Simonian siege of planning and regulation and guarantees spreads through the world, economic growth slows. And that's our current predicament. So learning is growth, and time, and a beautiful exposition of time and the economy by Gale and Marion here. Time, but money is the way we translate the ultimate scarcity. What remains scarce when everything else grows abundant under capitalism, and that is time. And that's why these time prices are not some device, tricky device that Gale and Marion contrived in order to show some cockeyed optimist Simonian vision. It's rather the most fundamental fact in economics is money as the way we translate the inexorable scarcity of time into the economy. And if you try to force money into being artificially abundant, you falsify all these price signals that are essential to guide the decisions of entrepreneurs into an ever more abundant future. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes or so for Q&A. I will ask you to please wait until the mic gets to you after I call on you. And then if you would please stand up and just tell us who you are and who you work for. And please finally make your question in a form of a question. So the first gentleman in the blue, yes, Don Boudreau over there.
Hi, I'm Don Boudreau. I teach at George Mason University. On the population elasticity, are there plans to disaggregate that to the country level? If you do it at a country level and look at the time prices at a country level, you can get some measure of the effectiveness of economic freedom. Because I assume the figure you used was world population, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and so if you disaggregate it to the country level, I feel pretty confident you'll find that in freer countries, that population elasticity is a lot higher than in less free countries. I just want to know if there are plans to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. We put the new equation on the table, and we're hopeful that people will begin to use that equation and apply it to different data sets. I think the issue there is we can try to measure a freedom index in a country and then look at the population and their economic growth and see if there's this relationship. It almost confirms the index in a way. Further support to substantiate that there is this correlation between freedom and growth and this tie to population. Where does the growth come from? It comes from human beings that have this freedom to create.
And I will just add to that one of the things that we want to do over the summer is to do these national level analyses, which are relatively easy to do for the United States because we do have wage income data for American unskilled laborers who are mostly of interest to people who care about the people at the very bottom of the income ladder, and then also for skilled laborers. Now, we are currently looking for data on incomes from long-run incomes in places like China and India, because that will also allow us to see the evolution of prices in the context of those countries. So if anybody has knowledge of that data, please let us know. Yes, in the back, on the right-hand side.
Hi, John Mueller from Cato and from Ohio State. Would you push the Simon issue back further? The real advance in prosperity and also in medical advances didn't start in 1980, but more or less in 1780. In other words, there's a huge period of time in which there was very little, apparently, economic progress or progress in terms of human welfare, in terms of medicine and so forth. And then suddenly there was this increase, particularly in the developed world, through the 19th century, and of course in the 20th and so on. Does this mean that people just didn't think until 1800 for millennia? How would Simon interpret that, in other words? Why that fairly abrupt change about 1800 or so, particularly in the developed world?
That's an interesting question. Madison, if you remember him, wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal and in 1999, and it was about the millennium, and he said the world poor until 1820, and he shows this being, and he offered some explanations for it. Deirdre McCloskey's got some explanations for it. I think Julian would probably say, look, if you give people a little bit of freedom, a little bit of dignity, and an opportunity to go to a market to test that idea to see if they're creating value, you can begin to see this abundance occur. So what pieces do we need? We don't. What we have on the planet is a poverty of freedom.
I would add. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I would add to that. One of the books, I believe, that came out shortly after my father's death that he wrote before he died, I think it came out around 2000, is a book called The Great Breakthrough, which addresses exactly this issue.
What was the solution?
It's been a while since I've read it, I must admit, but I believe it's my father.
Oh, your father.
But I believe it's a confluence of the things that Gale was just mentioning: population growth, better political and economic systems at the same time, some of those things gathering speed and then taking off. But it's been a while since I read it, but I believe those are the main elements.
As we explain in our paper in the introduction, population growth preceded economic growth by a few decades in Western Europe. So people stopped dying as flies because of huge advances in science and medicine. The slow retraction of medieval beliefs in what causes sickness, for example, such as the humor theory of sickness, and replacing that with the germ theory of disease. Also, inoculation and vaccinations came into the place when Europe was fundamentally very, very poor. But you do have this flourishing of human population that begins, an expansion of human population that begins in the late 18th century. And it's a sort of a virtuous cycle that more people are able to specialize and trade together. At the same time, you have the development of the steam engine and the massive growth in international trade and of the telegraph. So you have massive increase in the spread of information. So all I'm saying is that when you think about the history of our species, we are about 300,000 years old. Modernity, the world that you can recognize today, is the story of the last 250 years or so, which is to say 0.01% of the time that our species was on Earth. And there are different theories why that happened. I mean, you have Doug North and his institutional theories. You have Deirdre McCloskey. You have Steven Pinker. But their theories are not mutually exclusive. Bottom line is that it was the growth of economic and political freedom most broadly understood. The ability of scientists to pursue scientific discoveries and knowledge which was previously banned. I mean, how would you know about how to save a human being if for religious reasons you couldn't dissect their bodies for the first, for the last 1,000 years? All of that changes with the Enlightenment in the late 18th century, and that's where you have that breakthrough with the past.
I think that's, I just would like to add my favorite theory, which is Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton invented physics, but he also essentially created and enforced the gold standard, which fueled the whole British Empire, and this efflorescence of international trade that you identify as really a driving force of abundance.
Yes, sorry, you're right here in front.
Herb Rose, what effect, if any, do you think climate change has on this theory?
On what?
On what?
On the abundance consideration. Do you think that, has this been taken into account?
Zero.
I would, zero. Here's the deal, is I think that we see human beings facing all kinds of conditions, and they tend to innovate around those. They tend to innovate around problems, and that innovation process seems to be powerful enough to deal with any expectation that we might have with respect to these challenges going forward. And I would just say, we've got to give ourselves a little more credit and trust ourselves to be able to do that.
I would say the data actually shows something a little different. Since NASA's data goes back to 1880, and while we know that climate has changed much more dramatically before that, but since 1880, according to NASA's most recent data set, the temperature has gone up overall 1 degree centigrade. A lot of ups and a lot of downs. Up about a little over 70-some years, down roughly in the upper 50s, and no change a few years. So we don't know whether or not the climate will keep going in the direction it's going. In fact, the last 2 years, the temperature has gone down. But beyond that, let's assume for a second the temperature keeps going up. The Heartland Institute has put together, has published a recent booklet which compiles some data or brings forth some data that shows that roughly, depending on which country you're looking at, something like 10 times as many people die, that order of magnitude, of cold rather than of heat. So to the extent the climate is, to the extent our Earth is getting warmer, more people will live. More people will live longer, less people will die. That means that there will be more human beings alive, more knowledge, more creativity, more inventiveness, more solutions. So I have every reason to believe that to the extent the Earth does warm, it will actually be better. So I regret, in fact, that I doubt that the Earth is warming very much. It is warming a little bit so far recently. I wish it were warming more, is what I'm trying to say. The other thing I'd say about that is that a warming Earth tends to make the growing seasons longer in large portions of the planet. North America, most of it. Certainly, as you get into the northern half of North America, the great heartland of the Midwest, Canada, a lot of China, Russia, Europe, all those places will have much longer growing seasons and able to produce even more food, be more hospitable. If you live in Chicago, certainly more hospitable to life. We in Chicago like to say we don't call it climate change, we call it climate improvement.
One thing that does worry me is that the environmentalist movement, which in my opinion started as a very noble attempt to create a better symbiosis between human beings and the earth, the natural environment, is quickly turning into an anti-humanist project, which is growing darker by the day. The calls for women to eschew pregnancy and motherhood because every additional baby will be bad for the environment is, in my view, and a deeply anti-humanist and irrational approach to climate change and solution of climate change. Gale pointed to innovation as a potential way around global warming. If global warming is indeed caused by increases in CO2 levels, we do know how to produce a lot of energy without producing any CO2 at all. It is called nuclear energy. The Green Movement completely opposes it. We also do have a source of energy which produces half as much CO2 as burning of coal does in production of electricity. It's called natural gas. The Green Movement opposes that too. We also know how to grow more food with less use of pesticide and greater productivity, and that is through GMO planning. Sorry, GMO production. Technology, through GMO technology. That should enable us. That's right. So that should enable us to produce more food on less acreage, therefore securing more of nature for animals. And by using fewer pesticides, we do not have to worry about the runoff of the pesticides into rivers and ultimately oceans. What is the approach, or what is the response of the Green Movement to the GMO revolution? Complete opposition to it. So innovation is happening every day. Human beings are every day trying to come to resolution of the problems that remain, but they are facing opposition precisely from the people they are trying to placate. And so if there is nothing else that people take away from this particular forum and this particular lecture, it is that human beings are fundamentally problem solvers. It doesn't really matter what the problem is. There are people thinking of ways of solving those problems if we give them a chance to do it and if we listen to their advice. Yes, gentleman over there.
Thank you, Jonathan Chanis. I'm a huge fan of Julian Simon's work, and I think the index is important because perhaps you're proving that he was right. But I wonder if you're not claiming too much for it, because commodities have become less and less important in life. If you look at the costs of a pair of pants or a box of cereal, commodities now are in the single digit in terms of what the cost is. So you can have a decline in commodity prices, and it really will not necessarily have any real impact on what things cost for people. So the composition of the basket has changed, and are you overreaching with the index? I mean, even if your larger point is correct. And the second thing is, I wonder about your base year of 1980. And in the spirit of falsification, would your numbers be, I would think your numbers would be a lot different if your base year was 1965 and 1998. 1980 was 10 years after a huge commodity blow off. So you pick the top year to use your base. So that kind of is a little troubling. So, what would it look like if you run it with a different base year? And then finally, it was touched upon a little bit before, but what would the real-time cost look if you use the median instead of the mean? Because the mean is much higher than the median. And people's mean earnings,
Okay.
the mean wages.
I see what you mean. Okay.
The first issue on the percentage of where commodities fall, I think our issue there is if you look at that for the poor, it's a much higher percentage for them. So when we think about inequality and what do we do to lift the poor, if commodities are going down, the price of wheat, the price of oil, that's gonna affect them disproportionately much higher than it would with the rest of us. We also looked at these different base years. Our issue with 1980 was World Bank seemed to have the most data that started at 1980. So they have some stuff that's previous to that we've also looked at, and we hope to, in the future, be able to include that in our analysis. Their data sets kind of move a little bit over time. We also used that year kind of to honor Julian. That was the date that he picked, was 1980 for the bet. But yeah, of course, we can take these tools and look at different data sets and see what kind of coefficients and data that gets produced. And then the last question about median. Median income tends to be about 60% of mean income. So we can use that as a rough estimate. I think our issue is what's the percentage change over time? Not the absolute values, but what is that curve looking like? Is it the same rate of change? Yeah. Is it, I mean, in terms of the rate of change in income, the denominator in the time price equation.
I would only add to that, while 1980 may have been a somewhat high year to start with, if you look at my father's books, such as The Ultimate Resource 2, The State of Humanity, his data goes back as far as there is data, and the story, even using monetary prices, remains the same. There are little blips over time that go up and down, but largely the story remains the same. As population grows, prices fall. For virtually every commodity that is something we use, the story remains absolutely the same. And some of this data goes back well into the 1800s. As much data, his approach was, as much data as there is, he was going to use, and the story remains absolutely the same.
Since publishing of the paper, we have come across other data sets that we are planning to use in future research, which we will commence this summer, including data set of, I believe, 45 commodities from Professor Jacks. Can't remember which university he is at, but that goes back to 1850. So we should have a very good sense of where things are heading, adjusted for time price. Again, more research on this is going to be coming. And let me just reiterate, the base year was 1980 because that's when the famous wager started. So we just thought.
And I would add to that, by the way, I would slightly alter the phrasing that Gale used about the timing of the bet. My father did not choose 1980 to make the bet. He finally got an article published in Science magazine, which at that time was probably the most influential magazine read by scientists, may still be, after many attempts to get past some formidable obstacles. But when he got it published, he offered the bet then. He offered it, and that's when it was accepted. He didn't choose that year. Those who wanted to bet with him chose that year.
Which was a year of an absolute pitch of projections of soaring commodity prices, of future bio-crunch for the planet. That was the environment. He was running against the tide of opinion about the direction of prices.
That's why it seemed to be such an outlandish and crazy bet to make for people who were on Ehrlich's side. Many thought, why would Simon ever make such a bet? It's a fool's bet. Well, it was a fool's bet, but not the way Ehrlich thought.
Finally, we have just finished an analysis of food prices in America between 1990 and 2019, which we published on Human Progress. And we looked at 48 different food items. as they were documented and collected by the federal government in 1919. Then we compared it to food prices for the same items in 2019 at Walmart, and all of them fell in price, sometimes by a substantial margin. And the multiplier is just incredibly high. So there are these data sets. We are going to go through them, but it takes time. Yes, sir.
Daniel Berninger, I'm an entrepreneur. There's a lot of excitement these days about China bypassing the US in technology. In particular, I think it would be embarrassing if we compared our abundance index in the US to China. In 1980, China had, US had 50 times the per capita income of China. Today we have 5. And who knows what the future holds, but it seems like a sort of proxy for quality of policy. In the US was a relatively free country and maybe is less free today, I don't know. China was an unfree country and became free, but it does seem the abundance index would provide sort of a nice proxy for the quality of policy. And so I think today there's a lot of excitement about trade wars and prohibiting companies like Huawei, but really if you look at the big picture, the United States is in the position it's in for self-injury. It's not, doesn't have anything to do with what China was doing.
Anybody disagrees? No.
George is our China expert. His book, by the way, is number 1 or 2 in China. His new book.
It was for
Last week.
2
Yeah.
for a while. I don't know. It's hard to believe it, but I've spent months in China in the last 4 months or so, and it is exciting having a bestseller in China.
I would only add, I guess, 2 points. One is
It's life after Google.
I would only add 2 points to that. While I agree with your basic point, number one is China's economic per capita income in China has clearly gone up dramatically since 1980, since 1978, when Deng Xiaoping took over. But there's a lot to question about the Chinese statistics as well, and their growth rates are probably significantly lower, particularly in recent years, than they're claimed to be. And that's number one. Number two is poor countries, once they get relatively decent policy, almost always grow much more rapidly until they reach a somewhat higher level, a somewhat more closer to middle income level that rich countries do. That's inevitable, largely because the opportunities are greater when you have a poor society to make great gains through technology and other things that you can acquire from other countries and things like that. Having said that, though, I agree with your general point.
Okay. Young man in the middle.
I'm Andrew Sage, and I'm just a high school student. And I was wondering if the PEP of 9.3 is constant.
I can't hear you. Can you?
Yeah. So I was wondering if the PEP 9.3 number you gave us is a constant looking in the future, or if it's gonna, or how it's gonna change over time.
You know, the 1980 to 2017 data indicated the negative 0.93. We actually have done a preliminary data from 1980 to 2018, and it's closer to 1. So I think in the short term, you'll see that PEP moving up and down, but over the longer period, you'll see it tend to kind of move toward this -1, which the interpretation is you want to add 1 more % to the population, you can expect time prices to decline 1%. So if we're hopeful that that continues going forward, if it does, it means we add another 3 billion people to the planet, and what's going to happen to abundance? Well, will prices fall by another 60, 70%?
Though it bears thinking about that population projections, whilst they diverge, do expect a population peak at around, depending on who you listen to, between around 2080 or 2100. And some of the population specialists claim that we are going to peak at about 10 billion people. Others say closer to 12 billion people. But nobody expects population to grow indefinitely because economic growth, more opportunities for women in the workplace and more education for women in the workplace, and the growing opportunity cost of staying at home mean that women in places where birth rates are still above the global average, such as Sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, will probably trend downward as it happened in Asia. And so nobody expects that population growth will continue at the current rate and indefinitely, which then raises an obvious question. Where will the innovation come from? Will it come from AI, for example? I don't know. George, what do you think?
Well, I think AI is a very interesting phenomenon, and it's a valuable technology, but it poses zero threat to jobs. It actually creates jobs innovation, both people are not hired because they're unproductive. And so as technology is deployed, including AI, it renders people more productive and thus more employable, while at the same time generating the capital to endow new work. So AI is zero threat to employment. It actually stopping AI, however, it does pose a threat to employment, as all Luddite movements always do, threaten this process of innovation that creates new work. And I've been working on 2 connectomes to get a perspective on AI. One connectome is the internet, essentially, all the memories and data storage and processing connected to the internet. In order to map those connections, it takes a little more than a zettabyte. In other words, a zettabyte is 10 to the 21st. It's a vast number, and I've contemplated over the years when we'd enter the zettabyte era, and now we're in the zettabyte era. At the same time, and that zettabyte of internet connectivity entails gigawatts moving toward terawatts of energy to sustain it. Meanwhile, there's a great movement in neurobiology to map the human brain's connectome, all the connections in the one human brain. And to map all the connections in one human brain now appears to entail a zettabyte. And these connections in one human brain, the human zettabyte, runs on between 12 and 14 watts of energy compared to the gigawatts of the internet. And so each human brain is 1 billion times more cost-effective than the internet computational collective mind that people like Kevin Kelly project as solving all the problems of the world in one super mind on the internet. And this is why I believe that the more that the ultimate resource is that zettabyte of the human brain, not the zettabyte of artificial intelligence.
I'm glad you ended there because, as Julian Simon always used to say, with every hungry mouth comes a brain capable of innovation. And I think that's a wonderful way to end today's forum. That's all the time we have for questions. Before thanking our panelists, I would like to invite you to join us for lunch upstairs on the second floor. And please join us again. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you.